Hi there, everyone. I'm Dervilla Mullan. Welcome to the sixth NewsWhip Pulse webinar. I'm not Paul Quigley. I'm the Chief Product Officer because this webinar is being hosted by the product team in NewsWhip. We're here today to talk about how to understand crisis in 2020, and we're going to frame that conversation around a new feature that we're launching. We've announced it this week and it's coming in the next few weeks. I'm joined here by John Hayes, our Senior Product Manager, who's led the development of this feature. And the way we're going to run the 30 minutes is I'm going to spend a couple of minutes at the beginning explaining why we built this. Then we're going to spend most of the webinar with John showing you the feature using a couple of very interesting crisis examples. And then we're going to allow a little bit of time at the end for any questions. So if you do have any questions, please just enter them into the chat and we will hopefully have a bit of time to cover them at the end. So just going to quickly go through why we decided to focus on this. And the main reason is because crises matter so much. So we all know that no brand is immune from a crisis. And when it does happen, it has huge risks for the reputation of the company and its actual business. So the real question is not, will a crisis happen? It's actually about how you handle it when it does. And we know that why it matters so much how you handle it is because consumers and the public are watching and they're expecting a brand to respond to a crisis incredibly quickly within the first hour. But more importantly, they're going to judge you on how that response is handled. And that will actually influence purchase behavior and their attitude to the brand. And that can translate into real corporate value. So taking, for example, here a set of publicly listed companies, you can see how ineffective crisis management can have a 14% impact on the market value of public companies. Whereas actually, if a crisis is understood, well managed, good response, effectively dealt with, that entire damage can be mitigated and overcome or at least recovered. So I guess when the stakes are that high, we've asked ourselves, do the tools that the communications professionals handling these crises meet their need? And in particular, we asked ourselves, are they fit for purpose in the digital era of 2020? And when we looked at it, we felt they aren't. We felt the current toolkits have a couple of problems. Firstly, they tend to be very historically focused. And they're also really more about tracking the symptoms of the crisis rather than helping you understand the actual causes of the problem. So we wanted to explore how could we make the tools more forward-looking and to help increase that understanding of the underlying causes. So we've identified 4 particular pain points that we felt hinder comms professionals' ability to do that understanding really well. And I'm just going to quickly take you through them because that's what we focused on in creating our new crisis dashboards. Firstly, we know that the majority of brands use media monitoring to measure brand reputation. And here we believe we're actually measuring the wrong thing. We're using the output of the media as the metric when we're trying to understand public interest. And high media interest doesn't actually mean that the public cares. We often see that what the media is interested in is different to what the public is interested in, and vice versa. The public can care about something that the media isn't paying a lot of attention to. And if you don't have that public data, it means you can't tell how severe a crisis really is. You can't tell if the response is getting any engagement versus other messages and stories that are out there at the time. So that's a big problem. Secondly, as I said, we think we're measuring things too late. We want to know where a story's going, not how it performed yesterday or even an hour ago. And we need to quantify and predict that potential engagement. And existing tools generally have pretty low resolution social metrics, and they're at an article level only. And in a crisis situation, you need to be able to respond in real time. So if social scores are only updated infrequently, that's not going to be quick enough. Real time is essential. Thirdly, we think a lot of the tools today really give you information about the symptoms of the crisis rather than unpacking what's influencing it. Which articles about the crisis are attracting the engagement? Which journalists are most influencing the story? And when the public is engaging, which social influencers are amplifying that engagement? So today, if you want to try and pull that full picture together, it requires multiple tools, combining media monitoring tools with social listening tools. And the data sets are often incomparable when you're trying to combine mentions with media volume. And the process can be really time intensive and actually require quite a lot of investment. And finally, we think a lot of those social listening tools that are available focus on only some of the loudest voices. They're often very focused on Twitter, which is separate from what engagement are the web articles getting by the public, and they amplify those very loud activist voices. So it gives you a kind of skewed perspective. And for communicators, that's hard to reconcile those voices with the media being published, and they're all on separate systems. So with those four pain points in mind, we decided we wanted to build a new solution for this. So I'm now going to welcome John, who's led the development of this, to demo our new crisis dashboards. So John, you and the team, you've been completely immersed in this for most of 2020. Can you just firstly tell us the approach you've taken to the solution?
Sure. So as you say, I've been working this year with a team of engineers and designers to solve this problem, or this set of problems, using NewsWhip's data. And to give you a bit of background for people who might not be aware on what that data is, NewsWhip tracks over 500,000 websites in close to real time. And we discover new articles within a couple of minutes of them being published. And for every new article we discover, we're tracking, again in close to real time, how quickly they're being shared on social media. And we came to realize that we could use this data to build a real-time view of how both public and media interest in any issue is changing in real time. So today I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of this live in the product. Really excited to show you, and hopefully, as with most demos, nothing goes wrong. So we'll be starting out with a historical example from mid-October, and then I'll switch over to a live. So move over to a share screen now.
Maybe you could start, John, by just explaining what this dashboard is showing.
Sure. So there are three main components to the crisis dashboard view. On the left-hand side here, you're seeing the timeline. And this is showing how media interest and public interest are changing over time, where media interest is based on the number of articles published per hour, and public interest is based on the number of social media interactions with those articles. And you can choose to group that data by hour or by day. Next, we have the social media feeds, or cross-network feeds. And here we're seeing public social media posts about this issue from across Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and Instagram, and most recently, which was subject of our last webinar, with the integration of the Reddit fire hose of posts and comments. And you'll see why a little bit later, but Reddit in a crisis context can be a particularly powerful source of public opinion. And lastly, we have the author's view, and this shows you which journalists are driving most interest in any given subject.
And it looks like this example is about Johnson & Johnson. So can you just give us a little bit of context on the incident?
Yeah, so this is an incident from mid-October in which Johnson & Johnson paused development of their COVID vaccine after there was a case of unexplained illness in one of the trial participants.
And maybe we could start by looking at what's it telling us about media interest in this story?
Yeah, so the graphs are fully interactive, so you can interact with any point in this chart to see what was happening at a given point in time. So if we take media interest as an example, and just to clarify, all times I'll talk about today are in EST, so Eastern Standard Time. We can see that this article, or this incident, first broke on Monday, October 12, between 8 and 9 p.m. And if we interact with that point, we can quickly identify the origin of this incident. So in this case, it began with a Reuters article, And in that same hour, it was published by the Financial Post, Forex Live, and CNBC. And we can see just 1 hour later, between 9 and 10 p.m. that same night, it was picked up by 88 other articles. And here we can see it was picked up by most of the top tier publishers, CNN, Bloomberg, Business Insider, and Yahoo. And then just 2 hours later, we can see it hit a peak of 271 articles in a single hour. So just 2 hours after that first article by Reuters. And at this point, by scanning through the feed, we can get a sense that it was pushed out through most of the local syndicates of ABC, Fox News, and several other local publishers. And from that point, media interest started to taper off.
But overall, it was a lot of media interest, was it?
Yeah, so in this incident, we can see there were over 1,300 articles, and they were mostly from top tier publishers.
And then to flip then, what was the public interest in this?
Yeah, so for public interest, we can see that there were two main waves of engagement. The first one happened here between 10 and 11 p.m. on October 12. So this is just 2 hours after that first article from Reuters. We can then see from that point, interest started to wane overnight. So until about 6 or 7 a.m. the following morning. And at that point, we start to see a second wave of public interest in this article. That ran until about 12 or 1 p.m. the following day.
And can we identify which articles actually drove the public interest?
Yeah, so similar to the media interest chart, here we can interact with a point. So here I'll interact with the peak in the chart. And what we'll see are the articles that were driving most public interest at that specific point in time. So here we can see the CNN article in that 1 hour attracted almost 20,000 interactions. And we can also plot an individual article against the overall issue to see how interest in this one CNN article compares to interest in the overall issue.
That's really interesting because it looks like the CNN article pretty much attracted the full amount of interest of the incident.
Yeah, so that's what's most interesting about this. While the story was, or incident was written about by lots of other publishers, and some of them are major outlets like Bloomberg, public interest was concentrated almost exclusively in the CNN article. And the CNN article is quite factual and neutral in tone.
Brilliant. So you've introduced the whole timeline feature, public and media, but where did the cross-network feeds kind of come in to add to the story?
Yeah, so once you know how much the public is engaging with a given topic, you really need a bit more context about what they're saying or how they're feeling about the issue. So to learn more about that, you can flip over to the cross-network feeds. And here you'll see how people are really talking about this and what type of discussion is it generating. So taking Reddit as an example, what you can see pretty much immediately is which subreddits are talking about this. And for each post, you can click in and you land straight into the discussion of what people are saying about it. So that can give you a really strong sense of what the public really thinks about this incident.
And so if you were to summarize, having read a lot of that, scanned a lot of that, how would you summarize, say, for example, what the public discussion was on this topic?
Yeah, so I'll take Twitter first because Twitter is quite interesting for this one. The most popular tweet was in fact a commentary that this is a positive sign that vaccine safety protocols were effective. If the trial hadn't paused, then it would be a negative sign. So they were neutral and quite favorable of the Brown decision to halt. And the second most popular tweet was actually a quote of Johnson & Johnson's own statement. So when it comes to Twitter, people were favorable and factual.
And what about Reddit then in contrast?
Yeah, so Reddit, it was mostly discussed in the communities that you'd expect, like world news and politics. But what's really interesting about this case is the second most popular Reddit post is from the conspiracy subreddit. which for me, and I'm sure for most brands, would be a red flag and a cause for alarm. But when you dive into the discussion in that post, you can quickly see that they're not speculating that Johnson and Johnson are the conspirators, but that they're the victims of a conspiracy led by the GOP, which in itself is not obviously not necessarily factual, but you can deduce that people on Reddit also are not viewing Johnson and Johnson negatively in light of this incident.
Very interesting. And so if you were just to conclude on this example using our crisis dashboards, how would you sort of sum up what you took away from this incident?
Sure. So what we can see is there was a huge rate of media interest. A lot of articles were produced about this, but public interest was short-lived and concentrated with articles that were very neutral and factual. And the public discussion of this was primarily favorable and factual of J&J. So really there's nothing to indicate that J&J's brand reputation has been in any way harmed by this incident.
Very good. Okay, so look, that was a great overview of something that happened a few weeks ago, but we also know that this is very useful in real time, as I said earlier, a big problem for people. So could you give us now an example that's actually still evolving as we speak?
Absolutely. So I'm going to switch gears entirely. We've taken a look at a brand crisis, but now we're going to switch to a political example, and we'll look at the Hunter Biden email incident. So you may be familiar with this. It started back on October 14 with the now infamous New York Post article. And here we're looking at interest in this topic from the very beginning of that NY Post article all the way up to the present moment. And
the media interest in particular looks very sort of cyclical there.
Yeah, so here we're looking at interest by hour, and what we're seeing is interest peaks each day during daylight hours EST, and then dips overnight, which is kind of what you'd expect for a primarily US-based story. And by flipping over to viewing this day by day, what stands out to me at least is interest in this topic has continued at a really high rate from inception, from the day of that first story.
And you mentioned that famous story. So how specifically did that story perform in all of this?
Yeah, so the smoking gun story is now famous. What we can see here is it is by far the most engaged story about this incident. It hit more than 2.6 million interactions in total. And by plotting it, we can see that it really dominated those first 2 days of engagement in this incident. The 2.62 million interactions total puts it by far in the top 1% of articles of this year.
Wow, so any efforts to suppress it by Facebook or Twitter certainly didn't impact the spread. So like, can you tell us what might have caused the spread then?
Sure. So for each article in the feed, you can click through to see the article details view. And in here, you can see how interest in this one article has changed over time, but you can also see a list of the Facebook pages and Twitter accounts that are amplifying the story. And what stands out when you visit the Facebook view of this is it's been amplified by a lot of GOP accounts. So here we can see Jim Jordan and Rick Scott are amongst the top Facebook pages sharing this content. And if we flip over to Twitter, we can see that the top influencers include Donald Trump Jr. and Kellyanne Conway, who have both shared this post multiple times.
And were there any journalists who had a big influence in this story?
Yeah, so now we can flip over and see the top authors view for this. And what stood out to me immediately on this is the top 2 spots are taken by Emma Jo Morris and Gabrielle von Rouge, who you might know were the authors of that now infamous NY Post story. And you can click through to see more information about them. What else have they written about this issue? And here we can see that both Emma Jo and Gabrielle have both been writing pretty consistently about this topic. And when they do write about it, it tends to drive a lot of engagement. And you can see here that the rest of this list, the top 15, is almost exclusively made up of authors from right-leaning media outlets like NY Post, Fox News, Breitbart, and The Blaze. So they're primarily right-leaning media organizations.
And does that suggest that they were the only ones covering it?
Not at all. So yeah, you'd be forgiven for thinking that looking at the top authors view. But when I looked at this deeper, I saw that it has been covered by lots of neutral or left-leaning outlets too, like AP, Reuters, NY Times, and the Wall Street Journal. However, public interest in the Hunter Biden incident is being almost exclusively driven by right-leaning media.
And speaking of public interest, if we look back at that timeline view again there's obviously a massive peak last night. So
yeah,
maybe you want to talk through what's driving that.
Sure. So now I'll just filter down to the last 3 days so we can see that peak a little bit closer. And yeah, what we can see here is that interest surged yesterday in the run-up to the debate last night. So it hit 1.47 million interactions in a single hour between 12 and 1 p.m. EST. And what we can see about that time frame is this one article from Fox News was really driving public interest through that time. So yeah, we can see here there was a major surge in interest in that article, just where that peak lands.
And that article that's getting the most recent huge engagement wasn't even a new one.
No, it's a couple of days old. So we can see that, yeah, this article was actually published the day prior, but interest began to surge again yesterday, just in the lead up to the debate. And when you look a little bit closer at this, what you can see is that surge in interest was driven mostly by Fox and Friends resharing this article on their Facebook page. And that's not it. We can see the growth of this article isn't even stopping at this point. It's predicted to attract a further 30,000 interactions in the next day.
Amazing. Thanks, John. That's a brilliant demo. I could talk about that one all day, but we do need to allow a bit of time for a couple of questions. And before we do that, I just wanted to go back to those pain points that we had talked about and just check in terms of how we've addressed those in the solution. So if we just, I guess, look back at what we said were some of the problems. Firstly, in terms of monitoring the wrong thing, what you've shown us is a very rich and interactive timeline where we can combine media and public interest in one integrated view. We also said, measuring too late is no use in a crisis. So the real-time nature of this tool and the predictive signals mean you can react in the moment. And then in terms of obviously not just focusing on the symptoms, you helped us really explore those amplifiers, how people reacted to stories, and then how responses, say from a brand, were received. And then finally, obviously, we've got multiple networks in there, and we've also got the web engagement. So you're getting a very holistic view of that public interest rather than a focus just on the loudest voices. So I'm going to leave it there from a slides perspective and just allow a little bit of time for some questions. I've got a couple here that have come in. I guess the first one was just in terms of, like, today's news cycle is so rapid that people probably expect crises to be very short-lived. But there was a question about, have you an example of a crisis that, I guess, spanned a reasonably long time frame and has maintained public interest?
Yeah, well, you're right to speculate that most crises are short-lived. Most will peter out within a couple of days, but not all do. There are a couple of recent incidents of crises that have run over a period of several weeks, if not months. So one is the Apple and Fortnite crisis, so the incident where Apple and Epic Games are feuding over App Store policy. That's run over more than 2 months at this point. There's also the Netflix and Cuties example, which is run more than 6 weeks at this point. And typically with that type of crisis, what you'll notice is there are multiple distinct events that happen in that span of time. It's not that people are just consistently engaging with the initial information. It's that new information and new incidents are occurring that are then drawing new interest.
Brilliant, thanks. Then a couple of questions relating to features. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but one that's come up is around benchmarking, that people like to be able to compare crises. Is that something that the dashboards will let you do?
Yeah, well, the first iteration of this that goes to beta will allow you to look at a singular incident, but my team is currently working on building a compare view that will allow you to look at different crises over either the same time frame or different time frames. So you can really get some context on whether your issue is more significant or less significant than other crises that have preceded it.
Great. And then just a couple of very kind of quick, specific ones. Someone just wanted to understand what predicted interactions actually mean.
Sure. So what NewsWhip is typically measuring for an article is number of social media interactions that are occurring on it. And we do this at a really high frequency. So here we're seeing every like, shared, comment of an article, every retweet. And we do that at such a high frequency that allows us to predict the number of social media interactions that article will have in the future. So to give you an example, when an article is maybe 1 hour old, we'll predict what the number of social interactions it will have when it's 2 hours old. If an article is 24 hours old, we'll predict the score it will have when it's 48 hours old.
And then another kind of question around the feature is just how you set it up in terms of, I guess, how you'd search for a crisis. Is it by source or by keyword? Maybe you could just describe how you do that.
Sure. So all of the examples you saw today are based on keywords. I'm using Boolean queries so that it's quite narrow and excluding any noise that might typically show up in the search. But you can also limit your search by source or using other filters like media type and language.
Brilliant. I think we're going to leave it there because we're literally coming up to the end. And I just wanted to remind people that anyone who has Spike will be getting access to this in a phased basis over the coming weeks. They can get in touch with their CS person to express their interest. And we'll be following up, obviously, with a lot of support material. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to follow up afterwards. But thanks a million, John. It's really exciting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Cheers. Bye.